Marriage is the common thread found in almost every major religion in the world. The religions control it, and they control society with it to a large degree. Most cultures call it holy. There are only a few that do not. Though, while it is deemed holy, some cultures have turned the marriage covenant into an unimaginable curse. Some religions have even killed people in the name of marriage when the doctrines are violated. In some cultures, women are seriously sexually mutilated in preparation for marriage. In the liberated world, marriage has become increasingly a civil covenant that is easily made and easily broken. Marriage is also the historically most enduring covenant in civilization and remains almost universally the backbone of the platform for human generation. It has been given so many faces and customs and meanings that one wonders whether it may not be totally arbitrary, especially since nobody really knows where it came from, with it being rooted in the most distant beginnings of civilization. On the other hand, with it being one of the most universal institutions in the world, one also wonders whether the wide universality that spans the globe may not be an expression of the singularity of a profound spiritual principle standing behind it that is neither basically religious, civil, nor mystic. The most renowned modern scientist in the spiritual domain, the woman who had founded the Church of Christ Scientist in the late 1800s, that became renowned for its efficient practice of scientific Christian healing, had made absolutely no provisions for marriage in her church. However, while she made no provisions for marriage, in the textbook in which she documented her discovered spiritual science, the woman, Mary Baker Eddy, made the subject of marriage a high priority item. Close to the beginning of the book, the third chapter of 16 chapters bears the title Marriage. That's a paradox, right? But more perplexing than this is that she doesn't really define the deeply underlying operating dynamics of the principle of marriage and its process. This wasn't her style, but she did something that no one else had done. She set up a scientific foundation that enables society to discover the underlying principle for itself and experience its operating dynamics. She speaks to us as the most accomplished Christian healer of modern time. Mary Baker was a farmer's daughter who left behind her a wide movement dedicated to Christian spiritual healing. She had worked from 1866 onward on the project for discovering, documenting, and establishing the science that had healed her in a moment of great need. She worked every step along the way on a purely spiritual basis, but also on a scientific basis that can be passed on to others by teaching, through which her scientific practice became eventually applied in many parts of the world. Here we find her most widely known credentials that she developed over a span of 44 years of scientific work. Her spiritual and scientific perception on the subject of marriage was no doubt the cutting edge very early in the process, and no doubt remains so to the present. Still, she didn't flaunt it. This wasn't her style either. Her style was to lay down the critical principles in a far more impersonal manner than simply talking about them. She went back in time 18 centuries to the closing pages of the Christian holy book, the Bible, where an inspired writer spoke of the apocalypse, the end of all evil. In the closing pages appears a story of a great four-square city descending from God to humanity, that all the kings of the earth would bring their glory and honor into it, and likewise all nations. Mary Baker Eddy latched on to the idea of a four-square geometry of profound ideas, forming a city of interrelated scientific concepts, which she herself brought all of her works into it, without exceptions. She never spoke of its functioning, though. This wasn't needed. It doesn't take a genius to recognize the potential that this geometry can represent. For example, a four-square structure can be recognized as the structure of 4 rows of horizontally interconnected elements that represent levels of perception, and can also be recognized as 4 columns of vertically related elements that represent types of progression. Or it can be recognized in combination as a structure of 16 interrelated elements. Mary Baker Eddy rendered a broadly outlined description of the city that reflects these concepts. Thus everything that she created was created in 16 parts or multiples thereof, and whatever different forms pre-existed outside of the basic framework of her four-square city, she developed some profound scientific methods for adapting them to it. One of the pre-existing forms is the 7-part frame of 7 days that make up a week. The 7-part frame may have been forged in ancient days according to the rainbow colors, the 7-part spectrum of basic colors that blend together into white. Mary Baker Eddy used this model to define God, with a spectrum of 7 profound spiritual concepts, which she lists as principle, mind, soul, spirit, life, truth, and love. With these, we encounter another paradox. The paradox is located in a very large structure that Mary Baker Eddy brought into the city, together with a number of other structures, some of which are of interest here. The very large structure is provided in the form of a glossary that brings into the city 144 definitions of terms. This adds up to 9 specific definitions for each of the 16 elements of the four-square city. The paradox is that she didn't bring the entire spectrum that she defined for God into her glossary, as one would expect. She omitted 3 parts of the spectrum of God. The question is, why? Was it done for a purpose? Ironically, the solution for this paradox provides the solution for the marriage paradox. Are you confused yet? Let's take a simple approach to it. If one would select from her 144 glossary definitions, one defined term for each of the 16 elements that presents the highest concept for each element, one would select for the top elements in the 4 columns the 4 terms of the spectrum of God that are included in the glossary. However, if one would apply all the terms for the spectrum of God in the sequence in which she lists them in her definition for God, principle, mind, soul, spirit, life, truth, and love, and apply them in a manner a platform would be applied, from right to left, the result would be as shown. Doing this doesn't change the development flow represented in the columns, but it does give the entire structure some increased definition. The development flow is indicated here by other relevant terms from Mary Baker Eddy's glossary that are specific to the flow in the individual columns. The significant part at this point is that by this method the entire spectrum of God can be applied, though not all of it as constituents of the city, but 3 elements of it to give it special significance. The terms of the spectrum that are not included in the glossary structure become thereby singled out as 3 critical elements that define the entire structure as a whole. The term soul, when it is applied in the sequence as provided by Mary Baker Eddy, creates a dividing line across the entire structure that logically divides the structure down its center into a right half and a left half. The remaining 2 terms of the spectrum of God, which are truth and love, by them not being a specific part of the glossary structure, can now stand as a collective definition of the characteristics of the upper 2 rows, respectively. What significance this has for the marriage paradox comes to light when one explores what the division of the structure into a right half and a left half brings to bear on the whole. Mary Baker Eddy presented 2 terms in her glossary that have a dual definition that pertains to the same level, combining 2 columns. The terms are church and ark. When one compares the definitions for the 2 terms, it becomes apparent that the concept of church is designed to fulfill an outward-oriented function with an universal focus, such as to uplift society and the world, while the function of ark is inward-focused, focused on safety, located in divine truth, and in God and man coexisting and being eternal. The concept of temple fulfills a similar inward-focused purpose. It may therefore be applied secondarily. It becomes interesting to note in this context where Mary Baker Eddy has placed her chapter on marriage. Since her textbook is one of 4 development-oriented structures, its chapters apply in a progressive fashion, column by column, beginning at the lowest level and ending at the highest level. In this manner, the chapter Marriage, as the 3rd chapter, coincides with the first element of the 2nd row defined as love. In this position, the chapter pertains to the temple concept, the inward-looking concept, and is carried by love. In this context, the marriage idea comes to light as an affirmation of the honorable bond that love has forged. It becomes a celebration in the temple. The clergy has no place here to either sanctify it or deny it. Mary Baker Eddy made no provisions for any type of institution to reach into the temple of love and direct its unfolding. This simply isn't a function of a church. What matters here is more closely defined by Mary Baker Eddy with her glossary definition for the river Pison. She used the names of the 4 rivers that are listed in the first pages of the Bible as a metaphor to define what is flowing in the 4 columns. Mary Baker Eddy defined the river Pison as the love of the good and beautiful and their immortality. The simple scientific fact is that the whole of humanity is natively more closely married to one another by this love, by their common humanity, than by anything that is artificially instituted. The very attempt to institute artificially what already exists in science as a universal reflection of divine truth amounts to a denial of God. So why would one do it? In this context, the marriage bond then can only unfold as a discovery of a unity that already exists. This needs to be celebrated. It needs to be celebrated as an acknowledgement of this profound discovery, no matter what form it may take. The only directive that Mary Baker Eddy has in store for what unfolds at this particular element of the Foursquare City exists in the form of the applicable topic in her church manual. The topic is discipline. Discipline does demand great individual attention, not to let anything that is of spiritual value fall onto the ground and become lost. Apart from this, since the unity of humanity in divine love is universal, but not limited or stereotyped, no limit or specific form of its discovery and its celebration can ever apply to anyone, for to do so would be a denial of the reality that the marriage idea aims to manifest and celebrate. It would amount to a denial of the fullness of God's creation. This happens all too often and too easily in the shadow of a lack of attention to the operating principle. The phrase, denial of the fullness of God's creation, is the actual phrase that Mary Baker Eddy uses in one of her definitions for a wide range of marriage expressions. She presents a multi-part description of various types of marriage dynamics to set up an exploration of the principles involved. She did not present these in the chapter Marriage of her book. Instead, she lays them out as a platform designed for discovery. This was her style for dealing with the critical aspects that lay beyond the general perception of her time. Mary Baker Eddy presents this platform in the form of glossary definitions for 9 of the names of the children of the biblical Jacob, the men who later took on the name Israel. Jacob's story, as presented in the Bible, has all the features of a well-crafted, illustrative, historic fiction, in which the naming of Jacob's 12 children reflects the respective mother's mentality during the children's birth. The writer was illustrating a principle in this story. Also, the story is evidently fiction as it pertains to times from long before written languages were in use. Also, the number of children is suspicious, because 12 is a near-universal numeric metaphor derived from an ancient symbol, the hexagon, that is used to signify many or abundance. The metaphor of 12 to signify abundance is used 165 times in the Bible, including in the Jacob story. Since the story is evidently fiction for these reasons, it becomes interesting to explore what the writer had intended to illustrate about the marriage process that comes to light in a range of unique features in the story. To begin with, Jacob is presented in the story as a rat of a man. He conspires with his mother to deceive his father and thereby to cheat his brother out of what was most precious to him, his birthright blessing. But being this kind of an empty man, instead of facing the consequences of his deeds, the fictional Jacob flees to his mother's brother Laban, who lives in a distant land. When Jacob meets one of Laban's daughters, he falls in love with her at first sight and gladly agrees to work for Laban for 7 years to receive her for his wife. But on his wedding day he found that he married the older daughter Leah instead, who had to be married first according to custom. So Jacob worked for another 7 years to obtain the younger daughter Rachel also. However, Rachel, the girl of Jacob's dreams, turned out to be barren, while Leah bears him children. Leah uses her advantage as an asset to win Jacob's affection, though apparently with no success. On this note, the story unfolds. When Leah gives birth to her first child, and it was a son, sons were highly valued in an economy centered on manual labor, she utters with great joy, "Now my husband will love me." She names the child Reuben. The name can be interpreted as, "Behold a son." But was her child a gift of love, or was it a means for coercion? The naming suggests that it was for coercion. Mary Baker Eddy gave Leah's intention a scolding assessment. Leah's motive was based on a delusion, an error in thinking that was focused on corporeality, sensuality, which are aspects related to mortality instead of divinity. Mary Baker Eddy didn't comment on Leah's second child, Simeon, since the mother's mentality had remained the same, but she commented on Leah's third child, named Levi, which means attached, as she was still hoping that by bearing him children, her husband would become attached to her. Mary Baker Eddy interpreted the intention that is reflected in the name Levi as a sensual belief, denial of the fullness of God's creation, ecclesiastical despotism. Leah felt empty for not being loved. Rachel didn't fare any better. While Jacob loved her deeply, she didn't love herself. She felt inferior for not bearing children and envied her sister with a growing hatred. Thus, she was stuck in a similar denial of the fullness of God's creation. It appears that the Jacob story was written for a more deeply underlying purpose than to illustrate the dimensions of the marriage covenant. The Jacob story ends with a shock that exposes the dynamics of a love-devoid, circumcised society, which of course has its debilitating impact on marriage relationships. In the Jacob story, Leah finds herself trapped into this love-devoid environment by marriage, where she struggles to survive by playing along in an empty house ruled by controlling games, though she doesn't benefit anything by it, but finds her life increasingly wanting. Disappointed, Leah shifts her focus away from manipulating others to love her, focusing on what she already has and always will have, which is her own fullness in living that doesn't depend on any person's response, but on her own response. Thus, when she bears her fourth son, she says, "Now I will praise the Lord," and names the child Judah, which means object of praise. Mary Baker Eddy acknowledged the shift in focus, so that in defining the name Judah, she omitted the designation Jacob's son, and acknowledged the progress that Leah had made, referring to it as corporeal, material belief progressing and disappearing, the spiritual understanding of God and men appearing. Leah had changed her tune of thinking from denying the fullness of God to acknowledging the fullness of God. On this note, she is finally satisfied. She stops sparing children at this point. The writer of the Jacob story, though, didn't leave it with that. This would have been too simple. He adds a new increment of complexity, in which each of the two men giving their mate to Jacob as wife for the purpose of bearing children through them, which their mates do. So it was that in order not to be outdone by Leah, sparing children for Jacob, Rachel, Jacob's beloved who had remained barren, out of desperation offers her handmaiden to Jacob as a surrogate to have children through her. When a son is born to Rachel on this platform, Rachel names the child Dan, which means to judge, assuming that God has judged her worthy. But Mary Baker Eddy disagrees. She interprets the intention behind the surrogate birth as animal magnetism, error working out the designs of error, one belief preying upon another. She defines in this manner the nature of a physically wounded and empty society that goes to the nth degree in the game of controlling one another. The modern world is falling increasingly into this trap internationally. It has become the champion of it, with empire being its patron saint. Since Leah was no longer bearing children at this point in the story, she copies her sister's approach and gives her mate too to Jacob as wife, with no strings attached. When in due course a son is born on this platform, Leah names the child Gad, which means a troop is coming, a troop of children for the family. Mary Baker Eddy acknowledges the evident elevated intention that is reflected in the name Gad, and gives it extremely high praise. She calls it science, spiritual being understood, haste towards harmony. Do we face a paradox here? We have two physically identical processes described in the story. Both Rachel and Leah gave their mate to Jacob as wife for the purpose of having children, which they do. They have 2 children each. But why is there such a contrast in Mary Baker Eddy's assessments? Apparently the physical process wasn't the key factor in her comparison, which was instead focused on the radically different intentions of the 2 women that reflected different mental backgrounds. Rachel's intention had remained focused on personal gain under her continued denial of the fullness of God. This became evident in the naming of the children. She denied the singular, universal nature of humanity as the reflection of God, and saw herself isolated in her marriage, in competition with her sister. This apparently prompted Mary Baker Eddy's scathing assessment as animal magnetism, error working out the design of error, one belief preying upon another. With her scathing assessment of the intention represented by Rachel, Mary Baker Eddy defined also the underlying intention of the entire system of empire that aims to achieve world dominance, while it is so empty in itself that it has nothing to offer. It truly stands in denial of the fullness of God. Empire plays the nations as pawns in its self-centered empty games to steal profits from the world. In this context, Mary Baker Eddy is right on the mark in her glossary in defining the nature of the system of empire as error, working out the designs of error, one belief preying upon another. But Leah's intention, in contrast, was no longer for personal gain. It was carried by the mentality that had brought her peace. After years of struggling for it, she had finally realized that personal gain means nothing without the universal welfare of the family, and by extension the universal welfare of mankind, in which the acknowledgement of the fullness of God's creation is ultimately expressed. This mentality was carried forward into her surrogate relationship and was reflected there, of course, in the outcome. Leah had simply stepped above the broken step on the ladder that hadn't worked for her and raised herself to higher ground, where she focused on the universal welfare of the family instead, which she fully expressed in the naming of the resulting child as Gad. Thus, Leah's advance to the process of building for the general welfare became reflected in Mary Baker Eddy's definition for the name Gad as science, spiritual being understood, haste towards harmony. With this definition, Mary Baker Eddy provided a beautiful high-level definition for the spiritual dynamics of the marriage process, a type of acknowledgement of the fullness of God's creation. This dynamic flow appears totally fictional in today's world. It is hard to imagine that Leah's action would be possible in the modern world, such as a wife inviting her husband to have sex with her own friend and for them to have children together for the welfare of the family. That's impossible even in fiction, right? Nevertheless, Mary Baker Eddy gave Leah high praise for it, because the intention for her doing was there and had been developed up to this higher level stage for the universal benefit of all. The writer of Jacob's story was evidently aware of the motivating principle towards this high-level state. The principle is expressed in the naming of the second child born in Leah's wide-open process. Leah names the second child Asher. She says, "Happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed." Mary Baker Eddy defines the principle involved as hope and faith, spiritual compensation, the ills of the flesh rebuked. However, the writer of the Jacob story was evidently also aware that great discipline is required to maintain this high-level state, and also that such a state is rarely maintained in society. Thus, the writer lets the story collapse too at this point, He starts the collapse with the aid of the mysticism of the fabled mandrake plant, which is said to aid conception. Leah's son Reuben finds mandrakes in the field. Rachel wants some and offers Leah a night with Jacob in trade. On this basis, they both conceive. However, by Leah being able to bear children again, she finds herself drifting back into the old mentality of focusing on personal gain in denial of the fullness of God's creation. At the birth of her sixth son, Leah is back to where she started. She says, "Now will my husband love me, because I have given him 6 sons." Her children are again regarded as property, with a property value attached to be used for coercion. These types of regressions unfortunately have happened far too often in the real world. Small shifts in focus can change the whole world, and so the regressions are happening in our world as they do in the story, and will continue to happen until the chain is broken for their underlying cause. Mary Baker Eddy utilized the Jacob story to cut through some of the thick fog of fiction surrounding the marriage of humanity that unfolds in the smallest domain all the way to the international domain. She opens the horizon to the truth of the universal marriage of humanity as human beings, on which the wide world of civilization unfolds at every level. On this note, the writer of the Jacob story ultimately warns that if the underlying chain of fundamental errors that drive the collapse is not being cut in society, civilization is doomed to disintegrate, both individually and collectively. In the Jacob story, Rachel reached only once above the sewer of the empire mentality that she became trapped into, where she eventually died during childbirth. She reached her high point after the Mandrakes affair. What she had struggled for so many years, when she stopped struggling, suddenly happened naturally and effortlessly, as soft as a divine unfolding. And so, when a son was born to her, she named him Joseph. She acknowledged, "God has taken away my reproach and shall add to me another son." Mary Baker Eddy acknowledged that Jacob was no longer the focal point. Consequently, she omitted the designation Jacob's son. She defines Joseph as a corporeal mortal, a higher sense of truth rebuking mortal belief or error, and showing the immortality and supremacy of truth, pure affections, blessing its enemies. The human experience always reflects the underlying acknowledgement of the fullness of God's creation, or the denial of it, even when the latter results from regression, as in Leah's case happens at the end. In the collective context, Jacob's own story ends similarly. In the Jacob story, Jacob struggles with an angel, and when he wins his peace, he emerges with a new name, the name Israel. The story begins with Jacob being a circumcised person, but he comes to an impasse where he struggles with this denial of the fullness of God's creation and begins a transition to acknowledging the fullness of our universal divine humanity. Mary Baker Eddy defines this transition with her dual definition for the name Jacob, beginning with a corporeal mortal embracing duplicity, repentance, sensualism, ending with inspiration, the revelation of science, in which the so-called material senses yield to the spiritual sense of life and love. While Jacob had struggled himself out of the trap of being a circumcised person, his children had evidently not reached that high. From the emptiness of their own circumcision, acting on a platform of deception, the same platform that Jacob had stood on in the beginning, some of his children, joining together into a gang, attacked and killed all the men of a city. The people of the city had offered cooperative ties and intermarriage. They were answered with the sword. This type of answer is still given on a large scale in the modern world, where military gangs, richly financed on both sides by empire, now force the policies of empire onto helpless people, as in the case of Afghanistan, and by example onto the world. We fight wars not out of strength, but out of weakness, out of our inner emptiness, out of our inability or stubborn unwillingness to build a human world in which the fullness of God's creation is the light thereof, fully recognized, understood, and acknowledged. When the last F-14 Tomcat departed from the aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt, the entire game should have ended, and all the engines of war should have been sent to the scrapyard. Instead, we build bigger ones and more expensive ones that are draining our economies. We are sacrificing our very living on the altar of killing. We lay ourselves down to die in the unyielding and deepening denial of the fullness of God's creation, a denial that we staunchly maintain. Our universal marriage with one another is denied. We salute the weapon that is designed to destroy the marvelous divine creation that a human being is. If this is not a form of gross denial, what is? We have built the engines that can eradicate the human presence in a 1-hour war that destroys the environment that we require to live in. And we have placed those engines into the hands of those who hate humanity enough to destroy it. The only fullness that we have so far been able to demonstrate is a growing fullness of achievements in terror and in insanity. The 1-hour war that we have prepared for ourselves promises 100,000 Hiroshimas in destructive force, conservatively. And it is easily done, with a high degree of built-in automation. We even train our children in the art of insanity with entertainment focused on killing and destroying, from movies to video games. The self-denial of our own humanity has become increasingly the focus of our universal marriage platform, instead of the universal development of our humanity and our world with it. We have the materials, energy resources, and the technologies on hand to transform our world into a living paradise, even with a new ice age fast approaching, for which the transition has already begun. We have the physical resources at our feet in boundless abundance, largely unused. We have the capability to double the world food supply with ease, and produce high-quality houses in automated production with such ease that we can give them away to each other for free, as an investment into ourselves for a boundless future, ending homelessness, slum living, and rent slavery, and so on. But we don't use the capability. We deny ourselves a human future by not acknowledging the fullness of God that we embody as human beings, married to a profound humanity, and with it to one another. The dynamics for breaking out of the self-entrapment that is presently strangling our world is demonstrated in Jacob's story. It is demonstrated by Leah's transition in self-perception from Levi to Judah, and in Rachel's similar transition from Dan and Naphtali, where she wrestles with her sister, to Joseph, where she opened herself to experiencing universal good. With all this standing in the background, why would Mary Baker Eddy make provisions for society to perpetuate its low-level marriages in her church? She states, as if to answer such questions in her chapter on marriage, there is moral freedom in soul, the freedom to develop on the entire front. However, freedom rests on the twin pillars of responsibility and development. On this note, Mary Baker Eddy states, under the heading, Marriage Temporal, marriage is the legal and moral provision for generation among humankind. Until the spiritual creation is discerned intact, as apprehended and understood, and his kingdom is come as in the vision of the Apocalypse, where the corporeal sense of creation was cast out, and its spiritual sense was revealed from heaven, marriage will continue, subject to such moral regulations as will secure increasing virtue. Evidently, the state of civilization as a whole will reflect to a large measure society's progression on its marriage perception, from sense to soul, as it reaches higher and higher in its intentions towards the infinite plane. The infinite plane is unfolding in divine science. Mary Baker Eddy presents a visual reference to the Jacob story that places it into the universal context and into divine science, in the final sequential painting of her illustrated poem, Christ and Christmas. Mary Baker Eddy has defined 9 of the names of the 12 children of Jacob. She represents these names as critical 9 examples shown in metaphor in the form of 9 dark birds surrounding the central cross. As one would expect, this painting pertains to the same level in the Foursquare City that her textbook chapter Marriage pertains to. Mary Baker Eddy's illustrated poem Christ and Christmas contains 16 verses to which 16 scenes apply. If the poem and its illustrations are applied to the Foursquare City in a developmental sequence, the paintings with their reference to the Jacob story in the form of 9 birds, which is associated with the 15th verse, applies to the same row on which the chapter Marriage is located, but on the opposite end. This means that the subject of marriage is projected all the way through the entire row, touching on different dimensions of the row by which it becomes further defined. The prominent dimensions here are those of the 4 rivers that Mary Baker Eddy has defined in her glossary as follows. Pison, river, the love of the good and beautiful and their immortality. Gihon, the rights of woman, acknowledged morally, civilly, and socially. Hiddeker River. Divine science understood and acknowledged. Euphrates River. Divine science encompassing the universe and man. The true idea of God, a type of the glory which is to come. Metaphysics taking the place of physics, the reign of righteousness. The atmosphere of human belief, before it accepts sin, sickness, and death. A state of mortal thought, the only error of which is limitation, finity, the opposite of infinity. It appears that Mary Baker Eddy ultimately did provide for a high-level institution of marriage, one that is big and wide enough to cover the entire ground of the Foursquare City on every level. She calls the model for it the Mother Church of Christ Scientists, and the outcome of it, its membership. She presents for this model 16 major aspects that are critical for its functioning, which ultimately define the dynamics of civilization. The focal point that she laid out may be seen as a map for building a manual for civilization, a type of manual of the principles of civilization that evermore defines our universal marriage with one another as human beings. The 16 aspects shown reflect the guiding principles that she incorporated into her church manual. While the church manual bylaws are specific to the church as an organization, its guiding principles are universally significant for the whole of civilization. These are the topics on which an all-embracing manual for civilization will inevitably be built. This, of course, is a big subject all by itself. The building of the manual for civilization as a mental construct will likely be founded on the Foursquare foundation that has, to the present day, not been superseded for its all-encompassing scope and power. To what degree individual marriages shall reflect the large universal model cannot be imposed by anyone. It will unfold with the dynamics of individual progression. It may unfold in multiple types of manifestations, with multiple marriages interlinked in principle and commitment and freedom, and even possibly without specific forms attached, built on the acknowledgement of the principles that are operating. I have written 14 novels to explore this potentially boundless theme of progressing in our acknowledging of the fullness of God's creation, manifest in universal love and the wider recognition of our universal marriage with one another by our divine humanity. The theme is so large that 12 of the novels unfold as a single series, just to touch upon it. I have named this series The Lodging for the Rose. So wide is the scope of universal marriage on the infinite plane. I have made the novels accessible online for free. Mary Baker Eddy never stated what her ultimate vision is for the full spectrum of God being reflected in man and humanity. This wasn't her style. Still, she hinted that a grand progression has begun that has an inevitable grand outcome. She gave us a glimpse of her vision in her message to the 30,000 people who had come to Boston in 1906 for the dedication service for the just completed and fully paid for extension edifice for her original church. The giant edifice that seats 5,000, now a landmark in Boston, Massachusetts, was filled to the brim 6 times on this dedication day. Mary Baker Eddy's message to the 30,000 who had come was, "Choose ye." She concluded, "You have dexterously and wisely provided for the Mother Church of Christ Scientist a magnificent temple, wherein to enter and pray. Greatly impressed and encouraged thereby, deeply do I thank you for this proof of your progress, unity, and love." The modest edifice of the Mother Church of Christ Scientist began with the cross. Its excelsior extension is the crown. The room of your leader remains in the beginning of this edifice, evidencing the praise of babes and the word which proceeds out of the mouth of God. Its crowning ultimate rises to a mental monument, a superstructure high above the work of men's hands, even the outcome of their hearts, giving to the material a spiritual significance, the speed, beauty, and achievements of goodness. Methinks this church is the one edifice on earth which most prefigures self-abnegation, hope, faith, love catching a glimpse of glory. In today's world, the edifice stands largely empty. Spiritual values have been crowded out of sight by material values. The accepted material values are escalating into now near worldwide economic collapse, hyperinflation, terror and war, with thermonuclear war now standing ominous on the horizon. The collapse of spiritual values has been pushed so deep that society is now shutting down its most powerful energy resource, while burning ever more of its own food for little or no energy advantage, and this at a time when drought, flooding, and untimely frosts are taking their toll on agriculture. The spiritual horizon has become so empty that the food burning is now claiming the resources that would normally nourish 200 to 400 million people. A major portion of the food-deprived are sentenced to death thereby each year in the largest silent holocaust of all times. Our marriage model has become so exceedingly small that the annual murdering by starvation of over 100 million people, that's 3 times the population of Canada, no longer raises any concern and is fully accepted. On this road, the next step towards a thermonuclear holocaust, which no one may survive, is just a small step further. This vast collapse tragedy is now happening while the transition to the next Ice Age glaciation cycle is already in progress, which is swept under the rug with the depopulation tune being sung obediently for the masters of empire who are determined to prevent humanity from creating itself new agricultural infrastructures in the tropics before much of the current agriculture becomes disabled by the ongoing Ice Age transition. One can hardly think lower on the spiritual scale than society preparing itself with an unrelenting determination to commit suicide. The rolling train to hell cannot be stopped by any other means than spiritual means. The great tragedies of our present world are not political in nature, or economic, financial, or strategic. They are the result of a long cultivated void in the spiritual heart of humanity. The marriage of humanity with one another as human beings has become so extensively trashed that the greatest rape is now in progress. In the opening page of her textbook chapter Marriage, Mary Baker Eddy writes under the heading Fidelity Required. Infidelity to the marriage covenant is the social scourge of all races, the pestilence that worketh in darkness, the destruction that wastes at noonday. The commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, is no less imperative than the one, thou shalt not kill. There is little fidelity left in the modern world to the bonds of humanity with one another on which civilization rests. Industries are yanked out of communities and exported to slave-wage countries for the sake of profit, while the communities that had built up the industries in the first place are thrown onto the trash heap. This adds up to gross adultery against the unwritten marriage contracts that had built the communities and nations into viable entities. The USA, all by itself, needs now 30 million jobs, and substantially more than that to offset the menial employment, while the unmet needs in society are increasing. What we see happening today is a black testament that humanity's civil foundation, reflecting its spiritual value system, is being shredded and it's torn down. This needs to be rebuilt as a critical existential issue of our time. No other issue is presently greater than this. The rebuilding of the world's fast collapsing civilization is not a physical, technological, or even an economic issue. The potential exists right now for society to provide itself a vast supply of free, high-quality houses by the millions, and to double the world food supply with ease, even to build floating cities and floating agriculture. The materials to do this exist in abundance, and so do the needed energy resources. As I said before, even the technologies do already exist to start the process tomorrow. The only thing that is lacking at the present stage is the scientific spiritual platform that enables humanity universally to recognize its already existing native marriage to one another as human beings. Once this becomes established, no limits really exist that can hold back the potential unfolding of good. Ironically, the principle for the needed breakout to a brighter humanity has already been understood in early times. It was understood by the writer of the Jacob story and illustrated with the dynamics surrounding the birth of Gad and Asher. What was illustrated as a necessary requirement then still stands as a requirement today. It is reasonable to assume that the essential breakout that was illustrated as possible then is fully achievable in our time. No critical resources are missing. Even the most powerful scientific foundation for it that one can imagine has already been built, thanks to the achievements of Mary Baker Eddy that have come to light as a mental monument of the unfolding fullness of God's creation. The unfolding of the universal breakout from the current entrapment into today's dark emptiness may begin slowly at first, perhaps as a faint march of pennies, then dimes and dollars, followed politically by the trillions of dollars that society credits itself to uplift the platform of its civilization out of the swamps of monetarist poverty and political and ideological insanity, resetting the stage to the level of a new renaissance that the human being is divinely endowed to create and therefore will create. Nor does the story end here. There is something interesting indicated between the flowering cross and its 9 birds relating to the marriage concept and the crown above it. We see a ray of light focused by the crown that touches the base of the cross. We also see a similar flow happening above the cross. We see a white bird, perhaps a dove, descending, and 2 blackbirds ascending towards it. The 2 ascending birds evidently represent Gad and Asher. One can notice a symmetry here between the white and black bird, with a line drawn between them. This line may be the most critical line in the entire landscape of scientific spiritual perception. It determines our self-perception and uplifts our marriage concept once more. The little scene indicates that there exists a gap between the 2 birds. The gap is dynamically decreasing towards 0 distance. The 0 distance relationship was profoundly illustrated by Christ Jesus, who is reported to have said in numerous ways, "I and my Father are one." This is to say, in the universal context, that our humanity is our divinity. Science tells us that there is no difference between them. The 2 are one. Our humanity is our divinity. Science tells us that the apparent difference will vanish the more we discover of the truth that there is no difference in reality. This does not mean that man is God, but it does mean that man reflects God. On this scientific platform, the assertion becomes valid that the whole of mankind is married to one another as human beings, reflecting the singularity of our humanity, which is the scientific term of our divinity. We are married to one another, because we are invariably married to God as a divine idea anchored in infinite mind. What appears to be a dividing line between our humanity and our divinity is really a mirroring line. Here the concept of soul comes to the foreground once more, not as a dividing line, but as a uniting element. This small shift in perception uplifts the entire four-square dynamics even more than it did before. It is this element that is reflected when Jesus said, "I and my Father are one." It is the mirror in which we see our humanity and our divinity as one. It is the mirror in which we can see the reality of zero distance across the entire field of the universal marriage of humanity. This mirror is the Christ. Soul is its name in the spectrum of God. Soul mirrors the elements of truth, reflected as love. There is no fundamental difference existing here. Love exists because truth exists. The mirroring concept, of course, applies to all the aspects that are associated with the four-square city, and also those that define it. The corrective action that soul brings to bear when scientifically understood would radically alter the scene of the two crosses. Both crosses would vanish. The black cross exists only as a shadow of the unhealed marriage doctrine magnified. In the landscape of soul, the light flowing through the crown would be unobstructed. There would be no shadows cast, as there would be no obstructions on the way. This is also the title of the painting. The title is The Way. In the same manner as soul mirrors our divinity and our humanity, these two halves of the four-square city are mirrored by soul horizontally. The mirroring applies to the two halves as a whole, and also to its elements individually, element by element. And here too, there exists no separating distance between them. Nor can we stop at this point, because the zero-distance concept applies not only to our identity as human beings and to our relationship with one another, it applies also to where we want to go in terms of progressive achievements. In a zero-distance universe, we can be instantly wherever scientific progression inspires us to be. Once a truth is recognized, we are there. I wrote a science fiction novel a long time ago about traveling in a universe without distance. Its title is Flight Without Limits. While this capability may never be possible, or ever would be needed, it should certainly be possible mentally to cross vast distances instantaneously in terms of achievements of good by our humanity mirroring our divinity. This is what spiritual science renders us capable of achieving. Indeed, many aspects of our spiritual capability appear like science fiction fantasies in the present conventional world, especially in the context of marriage relationships. My novel, Roses at Dawn in an Ice Age World, deals with this challenge of rationality. One tiny example that is touched upon in the novel is the aspect of children. We speak of our children, but are they that? Sure, we start a process with sexual intercourse by which 9 months later a child is added to the family. And so we call the child our child. But really, our part in the process is so minuscule, it's hardly worth to mention. And even the initiating step is rarely occasioned by volition. The sexual movements and impulses that inspire intimacies typically take us for a ride to assure that what needs to happen to perpetuate our human civilization happens. Our typical personal involvement in the process adds up to next to zero. And once the process is started, it unfolds by its own divine processes that are way beyond our control or even beyond our comprehension, apart from the few glimpses that biological science has afforded to us. In real terms, humanity's children are the children of life, truth and love, the representatives of soul. When we speak of them as our children, we render our perception of them too small. we should see all children as the offspring of our humanity and our divinity, and one day, in the not-so-distant future, they will be regarded as such, and be honored and supported as such universally, as even, indeed, we will recognize ourselves so and one another. Then we will indeed manufacture high-quality houses for one another by the millions and give them to one another for free as an investment into ourselves, as we acknowledge us as the greatest asset on the planet. Then we will build the new agricultural infrastructures across the tropics that the coming ice age cannot reach to, whereby the long history of starvation, poverty, and war on our planet will end and become forgotten as if it had never existed. Listen to the song, listen to the heart, listen to the silence where strands of love unfold. Listen to the symphony of our humanity. In this symphony we are one with the universe itself. Harvest is seed time, thoughts ripening, carried as by a great wind. Carriers of secrets to unfold, thoughts winged with purpose, a force waiting, silent, patiently waiting for the moment.